On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Quentin Hartman. He is the VP of Infrastructure and DevOps at Velocity Global. We're going to be talking about the rebranding of DevOps. I know DevOps is new, but it's evolving as it has over the last decade, and where it's going. Quentin's doing some interesting things around a center of excellence, around bringing QA in as another pillar within his team. And I think he has a bunch of things that he's going to talk about with the audience that I think will be really interesting. Quentin, thanks for being on the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you. And we'll start off at the top with my two initial questions of what does Velocity Global do and what are your responsibilities there? And then we'll dive into the topic.
Yeah. So Velocity Global helps businesses pay and hire people internationally. That's really our core business. We do that through a variety of, historically speaking, manual work, but also introducing more and more technology to make it a better experience for both the employees and the employers that we help connect. It's really all about providing a world-class employee experience to people, no matter where they live and no matter where their employers are located. Traditionally, this is if a company wanted to do this on their own, it would be very, very complicated, very, very expensive. It would be yet another thing that they needed to worry about in terms of international compliance and things like that. We take on the burden of dealing with that complexity for the employers, and that's how we built our business. Specifically, my role at Velocity Global is kind of twofold. On the one hand, it's very, very technical in that myself and my teams manage all of our cloud infrastructure, all of the care and feeding of the technology that runs our platform. And then it's also, on the other hand, very social in that we also help manage the software development lifecycle and make recommendations and build what I like to call pavement and guardrails for our developers so that they can focus as much of their energy as possible on solving the business problems that they're needing to solve with their software and spend the minimum amount of effort on sort of turning the crank of the software development lifecycle process and getting distracted by that sort of ancillary work.
Awesome. You guys are growing real fast, and I'm sure there's good problems that come with it. Let's I guess at the high level, I know. In our pre-call, we talked about this subject and we talked about the rebranding of DevOps. Maybe let's start with what that means. Have the audience understand that, and then we'll kind of dive in from there.
Sure. So, I've always been kind of a DevOps skeptic. I've been involved with DevOps since 2012 or so. And back when DevOps was really sort of hitting the industry, I was kind of like, well, that's dumb. We don't need a name for that. That's just being a good system administrator. Because of course, that's where my background primarily comes from, is the Linux system administration, network engineering, that kind of stuff. And I had, heavily embraced automation and that kind of thing. And, obviously over in the intervening time, I've learned that that's not true, but I really still feel like that DevOps has a fundamental problem in that. And I think that it's most apparent in sort of the answer to the question of, I'm a new person and I want to get into DevOps. How do I do that? Right. And that I think really, really highlights the problem with DevOps, is that it's not truly just a single technical discipline. I like to call it a lens through which we focus other technical disciplines to get better results. So as a result, if you think about sort of what your ideal DevOps engineer is, they're a network admin, they're a cloud infrastructure admin, they're a storage admin, they're a little bit of a DBA. They're also really well versed in software development life cycles. They understand software architecture, that kind of stuff. And all of that is this huge umbrella of things that fall under that gets called DevOps. But there's no way that somebody who doesn't have years and years and years of experience in one or more of those roles can actually enter the DevOps space with any sort of, I guess you could call it honesty. Because when most organizations, when they say they're looking for a DevOps engineer, what they're really looking for is like a cloud infrastructure engineer or a build automation engineer or an observability engineer or something like that. And so at the same time that the value of the word DevOps has increased in the market, what it actually means has just gotten further and further diluted. And I think that ultimately is doing a disservice to the industry because it's making it really, really difficult to get new people into the field, right? And so what we're doing at Velocity Global is treating it a little bit differently, and we're not fully going as far as I would like us to. And that's simply because the rest of the industry sort of disagrees with us. And what historically has been called the DevOps team, I'm working on calling delivery engineering. And that is focusing primarily on the very kind of nuts and bolts technical elements of what has been called DevOps. Could be called cloud engineering, could be called automation engineering, that kind of thing. Really focused on the infrastructure, really focused on the build and deploy automation, that kind of stuff. And then, of course, has some amount of influence on the processes, right? The processes, however, are really going to be truly more owned by what we call the delivery excellence group. And the delivery excellence group is really more focused on sort of the social aspects, the people portions of things, coming up with processes and tools that are operable by the teams and are transparent to the teams, that produce the metrics that leadership wants to see in an automated way. So that way we don't have to spend extra effort trying to create those metrics. And then also ensuring that those metrics actually tell a true story about how the teams are doing and what they're producing and how well it's being produced. One of the tensions we have is like metrics around go backs, for example. On the one hand, that seems like a really interesting metric when it comes to quality. On the other hand, it sets up kind of a perverse incentive, right? Wherein somebody may be incentivized to not mark something as a go back because it would go against the team, right? And so we're working on sort of figuring out those sorts of things and coming up with those metrics that are most useful for giving that insight into how things are going, but still really creates the incentives for everybody to do the best work possible.
Yeah, I was going to ask you just one question about splitting the team. So, and I guess this is interesting. You mentioned DevOps is in a single discipline. It is very complex to hire for. You rarely see somebody with 1 year's experience moving into DevOps comfortably. It's not the typical path. So when now you're splitting out delivery engineering, and then there's a delivery excellence group to manage some of the less hard technical skills you need. When you're balancing that team, obviously, does each team have their own manager? Is there one person that then governs both those? How does that setup work?
Right. Well, so right now each team has their own manager, and I'm the manager on the delivery engineering side currently, and there's heavy collaboration. There's lots and lots of talking back and forth and making sure that things work. What works in someone's head also works when it actually meets the software and meets the equipment, right? But by splitting things up a little bit, I think I can illustrate the value of splitting it up by talking about the roles that exist on those teams. So on the delivery engineering team, we have a former software developer who has been a DevOps engineer for several years. We have a couple of infrastructure folks who have been DevOps engineers for a couple of years. We have someone who came out of a code boot camp and then moved into the DevOps space and has become a DevOps engineer. And then on the delivery excellence team, we have a couple agilists and we have a scrum master, right? And so in the on the one hand, another way to think about the split is tooling versus operations of tooling, right? It's to use sort of DevOps language. The delivery excellence team is more about how we work, and the delivery engineering team is more about how we enable the work, right? And then you also mentioned the third team that I'm responsible for is the QA team. And we decided to bring QA sort of under the DevOps umbrella, simply because, DevOps practices really are supposed to be about enabling the full SDLC. And how do you have a full SDLC without testing? How do you have a full SDLC without QA? If you're doing it in any sort of healthy way, you don't. The QA has to be part of the SDLC. And we found some interesting synergies there. We're focused really, really heavily on test automation and regression automation and things like that right now. We're scaling up our organization, and getting those sorts of efficiencies from automation is really, really important to us right now. And we have found that in an effort to do some more sophisticated deploy models and more sophisticated methods of testing using like ephemeral environments and things like that, making sure that we have folks from QA at the table when we're discussing exactly how we want to do that has proven really, really important, because there are, little handholds that you can build into the automation that are really important for QA in order to have them have their automation happen at the right time and happen in a timely manner, so things are all gated properly. And of course, in the I guess you could call it classic DevOps model, that's something else that the DevOps engineer has to be an expert in order for it to be accounted for properly. But if we acknowledge what I see as the truth, that DevOps is something that multiple people need to play in together, and having a DevOps engineer is ultimately a nearly futile exercise, we can bring multiple people together, each one of them having their own individual specialty, and then through collaboration can execute those DevOps practices much more effectively than one or two or three DevOps engineers could.
I guess let me ask you this question, because obviously bringing QA, automated testing makes sense. Bringing it into the pillar, I guess in some cases, we're talking about the practices and principles of DevOps. Is it a role? Should it be the engineering teams that are actually doing DevOps, which then obviously causes a problem? By splitting up your team this way, obviously you have a how and a why of the role. How does that, I guess, work with the rest of engineering?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's interesting. It seems to be working pretty well so far. This is still early days for all this, and right now we are still in the phase where we're doing a lot of stuff for the engineering teams, right? A lot of those pavement and guardrails still haven't been fully built yet. So we are still sort of in the critical path in some cases, but we're moving further and further away from that. We do releases to production about every other week, sometimes more frequently than that. And the DevOps team, for example, is only involved in those releases maybe 1 out of 4 times. And most of the times that we have to get involved in that, it's because of an escalation. It was not because of a planned issue. It was because the dev on call who was managing the release ran into something that they didn't know how to handle. And so they said, "Hey, I need some help with this." And we came in and we helped them get past it. And really that ultimately that's the model that we're working towards, is we want to create enough support systems, both in terms of processes and technology, so that the developers can be as self-service as possible through every single point in the SDLC, all the way from inception of their projects to operation of their projects, and make it so that they can manage that all themselves without having to become experts in every little piece along the way. And so, again, we're not there yet, but that's the ultimate goal. And really, that is sort of the ultimate. That's sort of the top level concern that I have all three of my teams thinking about as we're making decisions and as we're moving forward and designing new systems, is how is this going to better enable the development teams to take care of their own needs, be self-service, and work independently.
That's interesting, because obviously trying to make it self-service, I think you had mentioned at some point previously about remaining an enabler and not an impediment, which ties back into your first statement that DevOps is not a single discipline. It is very complex, multiple skill sets intertwined. I like the fact that providing that self-service functionality to the software engineers means that you guys are off solving other problems. I mean, that's the ultimate goal of the team, I suppose.
Yeah. And ultimately we want to get to the point where we have, let's call it version 1.0 of our self-service platform for our developers built out. Once that is done, we want the developers to be able to be sort of operating on that and working on it while we're in the background making improvements. As the compositions of teams change, as the size changes, as the technology landscape changes, we're going to constantly needing to be making refinements and improvements and changes. Another sort of the core principles that I talk with, particularly with the delivery engineering team, is the concept that we should be engineering our solutions to have a 9 to 12 month shelf life, right? Once something has been used that long, enough of the world will have changed around it that we're going to want to replace it, no matter how thoughtful we try to be about it up front. And so spending more time trying to perfect a system for a longer life cycle than that, in my opinion, in most cases, is just wasted effort. Just simply because the business itself is going to change. The needs of the business is going to change. And then along with that, the technology ecosystem that we're working within is also going to be changing. And so in a year's time, the odds of us having a solution in place that we designed a year ago that we're still happy with is basically zero. So trying to make that happen just feels like a waste of effort to me.
That's interesting, because obviously, moving to the, DevOps engineers always want to automate themselves out of work, which is what you hear. And then, what I just heard you say is, yes, but you can't just assume that because you have done all that automation, you can walk away. The automation itself has shelf life. You need to revisit it because requirements change, business changes, technology changes. And no matter, no matter the adage, if I want to automate myself out of a job, that is temporary, because you really need to be prepared for version 2 of that, automating yourself out of a job.
Right. Yeah. And honestly, I think that I think the genesis of a lot of the quote unquote DevOps tools that we see on the market today are people who decided that they wanted to engineer automation for a longer shelf life, right? And ultimately what they ended up building was this really robust, complicated productizable thing that they were ultimately able to bring to market, because it wasn't just automation. It was a framework to build automation within, right? And if that's what you want to do with your DevOps team, I think that's really, really cool. And it's an interesting exercise, but it's a lot of extra effort that in most cases doesn't bring additional business. It doesn't bring additional value to the business. And so I would say that most folks shouldn't be in the business of trying to do that. You build something that maybe it's a little fragile, maybe it's not exactly perfect, but if it's going to be able to meet your needs for 6 to 9 to 12 months, then that's valuable. And that buys you time to then work on the next thing.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that's that could make for a very interesting roundtable discussion of automation and how long and how much effort, and that trade-off of yes, I don't need to touch it longer, but to your point, if you're going to overcomplicate the solution, maintenance might be a little bit more challenging down the road eventually. And there's other components versus, hey, just enough. I like the term, it might be slightly fragile, but it's going to hold up for the 6 months, come back to it and adjust it versus hoping to build, the strongest thing you can. So that's very interesting. I know we're kind of coming up against our time. I was going to ask you one other question about this before we do end this area. When you're kind of looking at a company that potentially is trying to get into splitting up the team and potentially taking a path that you've taken, right? So, separating the how and the why and the tools, whatnot. Is there any advice you'd have of wanting to go about that? Because obviously DevOps is really complicated, and right now it's pretty much done a certain way. Is there any advice of if you're looking to go down the path that you did, what advice you'd have for somebody else?
Well, I think the biggest thing is to take an iterative approach to it, right? I would say don't have like this bright line and this line in the sand. It's like, okay, now we're doing things totally differently. Take the processes and the structures that you've been working with and just adapt them over time. Something I heard recently that I thought was really insightful is your org chart should always be written in pencil, right? And I think that this kind of adaptation really illustrates that well, because it is going to be a little bit amorphous as you're making that transition. And to be totally frank, we're still in the middle of it. It's not done by any stretch of the imagination. But I think one of the most important things is to have a really well-defined vision of what you're trying to achieve in terms of really honoring the spirit of DevOps processes and practices, and really, bringing in that agile component and bringing in all of those low-level practices that made DevOps work and that made DevOps so revolutionary 10 years ago. And just rather than trying to do the apparently obvious thing of bundling all those things into one single unit or one single person, acknowledge that it's really more about how you work and spread that ethos across those people who all have those deep skills in the various areas that DevOps touches, and empower them to work together.
Very cool. Yeah, I mean, that's a great starting point. Definitely appreciate your insight. If you have a, I guess for a next guest that comes on, I like to leave a question behind for them or a topic that you might be interested in having them address. Is there anything that you'd like them to cover, or any question or topic, anything like that?
Well, I've always had valued having a little bit of a decoupling between my infrastructure and my cloud platform. And that was always with sort of this notion of what if we go multi-cloud someday? And I've kind of come to the opinion that in most cases, most organizations that go multi-cloud are doing it because of M&A sorts of operations and things like that, not because of technical drivers. I would love to see a conversation around sort of the reality of multi-cloud today, why an organization went multi-cloud, whether or not it turned out to be a good idea, that kind of thing.
Awesome. That's a great one. I think multi-cloud's come up a couple of times. I've got to do a little searching to see if I can find somebody who is a cloud expert that could talk about some of the wins around that. Somebody's listening. I think that's the second time I've heard it. I haven't aired this episode yet, so somebody will probably hear the same topic twice. So I got to get myself in gear and find somebody for that. But other question is, if somebody wants to reach out to you, talk to you about what you've discussed on the podcast, is LinkedIn another social platform a better way of getting a hold of you?
LinkedIn, Twitter, Mastodon. I am Q Hartman on most platforms that I'm findable on. qhartman@gmail.com is my personal email if people want to hit me up there. And yeah, always open to discussions on interesting tech stuff.
Brilliant. I will include those links in the show notes. Again, thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing. I appreciate your time.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely. That's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, if you did find the episode interesting, please share it. That's how the podcast has grown. And that's how we'll continue to grow. So thank you for doing that. And if you know someone or you yourself can speak to Quentin's topic he mentioned in terms of talking about multi-cloud and some of the benefits and challenges, love to have you on. I think other people would benefit from listening to that. Reach out to me, let me know. If not, until next time, thank you and goodbye.